Welcome back. Thanks for joining me again as we get started on section 1.5, AWS Global Infrastructure. Our topics are going to include regions, availability zones, data centers, and then we'll talk about what's in it for you. So the AWS Global Infrastructure has 21 regions around the world with 64 availability zones. And we're going to talk about what availability zones are here in just a couple of minutes. Just know that more regions and availability zones are being added. All of the red circles that you see on this AWS Global Infrastructure map represent regions that are coming soon. At the highest level, AWS's physical infrastructure is made up of numerous regions around the world, and each region is comprised of multiple availability zones. Availability zones are where your actual AWS resources are located. So let's take a look at the hierarchy for AWS. So we know we have multiple regions. So I'm going to just say that this is a single region. And within that region, we have multiple availability zones, which we're going to talk about in just a minute. So every region will have at a minimum 2, but may also have 3 or more availability zones within them. So this is a region, and then these are availability zones. So let's think of a region like Northern Virginia. That is the US East 1 region for AWS. That region has 6 availability zones in it. Inside of each availability zone is a data center. And it could be one or it could be more data centers within that availability zone. But all of the resources that you provision go inside of that data center. Okay, we're going to take a look at this as we go through the slide, but visually I wanted you to put together in your head, you have the region. Inside of the region, you have availability zones, and inside of the availability zones, you have one or more data centers where the AWS resources reside. So let's take a look at this AWS Global Infrastructure map. This is a pretty cool map that AWS has put together, and you can see that it shows you the resources that exist within AWS. So the orange represents AWS regions that exist all around the world. Okay, so you can see here that these regions exist in different geographical areas of the world. If we scroll this way, there's our United States map, and here is Northern Virginia with that US East 1 region that I described to you. I'm going to go ahead and click on that region and notice that there are 6 availability zones within that region. So if we look at the definition for availability zones work together to make up a collection of AWS resources. Properly designed applications utilize multiple availability zones for high availability and fault tolerance. Those were our definitions or terms that we learned previously. Availability zones have direct, low latency connections between each other, and each availability zone is isolated from others to ensure fault tolerance. Now, when we say it's low latency, we basically mean that it's a fast connection between the sites, and there's not a lot of delay or lag when traffic is sent between the availability zones. So I'm going to go ahead and close this pop-up. So those were our availability zones outlined here in blue. These pink circles represent points of presence. Points of presence are essentially what we call edge locations that are geographically dispersed around the world where AWS can replicate data and certain services. So think about an application like CloudFront. We'll talk about CloudFront much later in the course, but basically think about how you go to access a web page And no matter where you are in the world, you want that web page to load quickly. You want the images to pop up fast on your desktop and the desktop of all of your users. So AWS uses their global network and these points of presence to replicate that data in those applications all around the world. And in that way, everyone is able to get fast access to that data. And again, that's an oversimplification of what CloudFront can do, but that gives you an idea of what CloudFront is and how these points of presence are utilized. And then you have the networks. So all of these white lines that you see, the dotted lines, represent AWS networks. These networks, again, connect the AWS availability zones and regions together. They're fast networks, and they even have transoceanic cables that run across the ground under the ocean to link their regions that are located in different parts of the world. That's actually pretty cool, right? Think about the fact that somebody went underwater and laid cable so that networks could communicate with each other at various places across the world. So there are some other things on here that we're not going to directly cover, but just be aware that they're there. So far, we've talked about the region and we talked about the availability zones and how the availability zones are able to replicate data between them for high availability. Remember that this high availability is not always automatic. There are some services that do replicate data between different availability zones automatically, but there are others where you, as you provision, have to architect or design your environment correctly to create that high availability across availability zones and across regions. So let's go ahead and take a look at the next piece, which is the data center. So inside of our availability zone, we have one or more data centers. So these data centers are where the resources that we access and use for AWS are actually located. So the physical servers, the storage, the compute, the network gear, all of this equipment is located within AWS data centers. When we create our own virtual resources, they reside in these data centers. So that might be a bit of a tough concept, right? You see physical servers there, but we actually create virtual resources like a virtual server that is a logical server that resides on the physical hardware. So it's not tied to that physical hardware. If that hardware was starting to fail, we could move that virtual server to a new piece of hardware. That's one of the advantages of using virtualization. But all of those resources reside within AWS data centers, and then it can be replicated, or we can allow resources to communicate between the different data centers. So think about benefits for you. You get to provision resources closest to the people that need to use them. So let's say that you had users that were in Japan. You could create resources in a region that is in or near Japan that will allow your users to access them efficiently and with the least amount of latency. If you have some users in America, you could do the same thing, right? You create resources in the regions that are closest to those users. You have multiple availability zones and regions, so the AWS environment is fault tolerant and highly available. Now, that doesn't mean that something can never go wrong. The other thing that's nice is that it can expand high availability beyond a single geographical location. So think about if you needed to separate data for high availability in different parts of the world. You have an office in London and you have an office in Northern Virginia. You can actually replicate that data between the AWS regions across the AWS network. This dotted digital network that crosses the ocean, you could replicate data across it. Or you could have application servers that communicate with each other across those connections. Also, your applications may be configured for high availability by provisioning them in multiple regions for failover disaster recovery, right? Again, that's kind of what I was just talking about. You have the ability, based on your application and what your application can do, you can have that availability within the same geographical region across different availability zones or across multiple regions. So let's look at what AWS says the benefits are, what's in it for you. And you can see here what AWS sees, they say their benefits are. You can actually click on these and they actually have little paragraphs that give you more details about those benefits. I'm not going to go through and read each of those, but if you have some interest, you can go to the website here at the top and find out more information about AWS benefits. So that's going to do it for this lesson on the AWS Global Infrastructure. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next lesson.